This is Tiffany Rosier, the host of the Afros and Knives podcast. We use the Anchor podcasting app to create and distribute the show. Creating a podcast on Anchor is effortless. It allows you to record a high-quality podcast and distribute it everywhere, including Google Podcast and Apple Podcast. They distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere. You can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. No fancy equipment or podcasting experience is necessary, and it's 100% free. As long as you have a story to tell, Anchor is the platform to use. Share your story through audio using the Anchor app for Android, iPhone, or your desktop. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Welcome back to the Afros and Knives podcast. I am your host, Tiffany Rosier, and this week's conversation is with chef, writer, and Black food historian, Therese Nelson. This is that unapologetically Black episode. We talk about the diaspora, we talk about the roots of American cooking, and the future of Black foodways. I love this episode so much, and I appreciate Therese coming on and having this conversation. It's long overdue. So let's get to it.
So thanks so much for having me. My name is Therese Nelson. Lots of things. Mainly a private chef. My career started probably about 15 years ago after graduating from Johnson & Wales. I really knew back then that I wanted to be a caterer, but sort of navigating how to figure that out and how to get the tools I needed to be sort of credible in that space. I worked mainly in hotels, so spent the first sort of 4 or 5 years of my professional life post-grad working around the country in hotels, and then landed back in New York. I'm from Newark, New Jersey originally, and we started navigating and working through the maze of New York City, and found some partners who were developing their own cookbook series, and everything sort of guided from there. Started a very small boutique catering company just at the moment when I think larger brands were realizing that women of color really did have disposable income and really were sort of an untapped market. So did lots of catering with brands like Essence and Black Enterprise and American Express, and all that sort of turned into all of our lives changing to cookbooks past that, and now sort of changed our practice into mainly private chef work. But about a decade ago, through navigating the professional side of my career, I really sort of saw the void that there was in chefs of color, specifically Black chefs, being able to sort of use our culture and our work. There was this moment where I was looking around in all of these food spaces, television, multiple forms of media, but just in my daily life, where I wasn't seeing my peers. I wasn't interacting with other chefs of color in a way that was impactful. And lots of the reasons why I wanted to come to this work originally, I just wasn't connecting to. I hadn't picked up Taste of Country Cooking since high school. I wasn't really connected to all those things intuitively I knew that told me I was a uniquely American chef. Our history in this country tells us that. And so I started this project called Black Culinary History, just sort of for personal catharsis. I wanted to, for my own edification and my own sort of centeredness, be connected to why we do this work and why we why we should all, especially Black chefs, know for sure that we are uniquely American. And so it became this sort of quest for history. It became an obsession about reading everything I could and sort of having this one hub that was at the same time about our culinary past, knowing the truth for sure, networking so that I found and was inspired by working chefs and knew who was working and doing dope work around the country, but also recognizing the idea of legacy and sort of baton pass and be an example, sort of a hub for young people to have this like sort of centerpiece of information they had to use in their own work. Because I knew that if I was at sort of the first turning point in my own work, that surely the young ones coming behind me would have a similar struggle. So it's been about 10 years of that work, and it's grown exponentially, and just the progress and the sort of encouragement of the progression of all that time, slow and steady growth, has shown me like the power of just staying your course and doing work that is quiet, intentional, and rooted. It's sort of paid off in dividends in my own work, but also in our community. It's so dope to see all of the cool things that happen just from building community in small, intentional ways.
I love it. I mean, finding your work was just like a confirmation that, you know, the work that we do is creating space for us in the present, but also allowing the work that has been done before we got here to be represented as well, creating space for the past as well. And to your point about, you know, just media at large and how we are represented in media. And you know, for me, I think the first thing I always see is that it's limiting. We're not considered global. And so there's a very small little keyhole that we're allowed to fit in. And then outside of that, you know, we're absent from a lot of other spaces I think are just vital. I know there was, I think it was Portia Wilson that was talking about, that wrote an article about having Black culinary history in culinary school and making sure that that's part of the curriculum as well. And because, you know, most traditional culinary schools, they teach from, you know, a French perspective. You know, that's kind of the baseline for all classic cooking, as people would consider it. And so for me, I'm interested in knowing, like, with your culinary education and your experience, what was your pathway to integrate like all the information you were finding about our past history? And, you know, once you started to find that information, you were saying, you know, how did you let it inform your cooking and your work?
Sure. So I'll say a couple things. One, this is all a process, right? Like, I recognize, like, I want to say this coming December will be 11 years. It was the Christmas of 2008. I was having this sort of epiphany, this moment where, like, we were just, my partners and I were in a transition with our business. I had I've been working in a hotel full time, plus building this very tiny catering company. And it was this moment of like, okay, I'm going to, you know, step out on faith and do this, you know, work with our company full time. And that was right when the economy downturned. So I was in this like sort of personal crisis. And so the work came out of like, not even crisis, but just a sense of like, you know, making moves professionally, but also having like serious personal rooted reasons why you were doing this work. And so I'll say that over 10 years, it's been a process of just knowing for sure the truth, right? It was probably 5 years ago now. I was in Austin. Tony Tipton Martin kind of put the bad signal out for the 150th anniversary of emancipation. So Juneteenth, 150th anniversary, and she said, let's just get all the brown food folks around the country. So it was all the people who you would know. It was the dopest writers and chefs, and you know, from Jessica Harris to most of the chefs and folks you know. And we're in Austin in this one place, in this chapel, with this whole day of symposiums, right? And this really interesting collective, right? And in that moment, with the smartest, best minds you could think of in the country, there was still this sense of how do we define our foodways and what does that even mean? I'm talking about Jessica Harris, who's given us 14 cookbooks. At that point, High on the Hog was, to me, the sort of foundational work that sort of contextualized Blackness in American foodways. And even in that room with all these minds, there was still this moment of trying to figure out how we use the collective history we know from the limited scholarship, as well as what we know intuitively and what we know professionally. How do we use that to define our foodways in the zeitgeist? And so Portia is brilliant, and her piece was absolutely right that I think culinary schools have to be more responsible to broader cultural points of reference. But at this point, I'm unsure that it's going to look like hardcore curriculum. To me, it should look like sort of supplements, right? Like, I went to Johnson Wales, CIA, most of the culinary schools around the country. Why there not more? There should be a sense of innovation, right? There are chefs willing to and that need to come along and provide sort of an extra layer of cultural context. Why is Kwame Onwuachi not, doing week-long intensives around his points of reference from West Africa, the Caribbean, what he's doing in Kitchen Camp? Why aren't, why Michael Tweedy would come forward? That I think that it would look more like that, because at this point, we need more scholarship. We need more books published. We need more context to sort of allow for the breadth and the time and the resources to be put into the fullness and the documentation of our foodways in the same way other cultures have. I think I think about CIA's at its beginning was essentially a GI Bill. All these soldiers coming back from war using the GI Bill to get training in the industry that was emerging. So you're talking about Jefferson Evans in the late 40s, early 50s, when the industry was just sort of coming to pass. So like your point, French cuisine was it. French cuisine was the height of sophistication. And even in those moments, it was still Black and brown chefs who were using the GI Bill in an expensive way to get that foundational information. But then it took another 15, 20 years for them to start integrating Italian cuisine and Asian cuisine. And so my point is just that our foodways, we have just come to a place where we're getting past the necessity of identity conversations, right? We're fighting and writing about, I do a lot of freelance writing, a lot of public talks, and even now, decade in, we're just getting past the moment where it's less about fighting for a place of identity and more about what these foodways look like, right? The Times article that just came out a couple weeks ago, the 16 chefs that are influencing Black foodways and influencing the country who happen to be Black. That list was not exhaustive, but it was absolutely iconic because it was emblematic of the spaces and sort of the breadth of spaces that chefs of color, Black chefs occupy. But to me, that turning point was that the Times in that moment was saying, look, here's a collection of 16 chefs from all across the country who represent different identities, are cooking vastly different cuisines. Here they are. This is a small percentage or small representation of the hundreds of chefs around the country who are doing this work. Okay, let's take a breath. Now we can start talking about the food. Now we can start talking about how we're defining these collective diasporic foodways and what does that look like. So now it's to me about getting more book deals, getting more cookbooks that represent these foodways. This is about, culinary schools sort of seeing the power and the longevity and sort of the pride of place that these foodways have in the culinary zeitgeist. And so you have to prepare your students to cook these foodways. It's going to look like a lot of things. It's going to look like cultural spaces like Schomburg Center, and any museum space that really wants to talk about Black culture, having to think about food expansively. And so there are many ways that this work is going to show itself. I mean, Museum of Food and Drink is doing an exhibit next year around Black foodways, and so it's going to take slow, steady, methodical movement, but I don't know that it's going to look one particular way. I think it's going to take lots of disciplines, lots of disparate disciplines, and I think that it's going to take everybody kind of contributing their own points of view. It's the Harlem Renaissance, right? Like,
absolutely,
we're in the midst of the Black arts movement.
Absolutely. And to your point about at least publications and more information, I was in the bookstore last weekend, and I'm walking through the cookbook section, of course, and it's just homogenous and everything looks the same color, same food. And my frustration was, it wasn't so much that all the chefs looked the same, and that the style of writing and the voices are still very similar to each other. My bigger issue was the lack of diversity in just cuisine overall. Like the more you can cook outside of your comfort zone, the better cook you are. Like, it's just, as a chef, I kind of go, if you don't challenge yourself to kind of go outside of your norm, you don't get better. You essentially are cooking the same things, just in a slightly different way, maybe with a different, group of seasonings, but it's a lot. It's always, redundancy. And so for me, I was more bothered by the lack of diversity in that space. And then to challenge people to dig deeper and to deep dive into the history, and just to find the techniques, just to find the flavor profiles, like not just, past the cultural implications of that, but to create better chefs, to create a better food culture, is to kind of, to integrate this as essential information and not secondary information, not like one of those kind of little feature cards in culinary history. It's, it's an integral part. For me, I'm like, Black cooks are an integral part of American history. And it's not reflected in American history just yet the way it should be. If it wasn't for, bringing enslaved people into the continent, you wouldn't have an American cuisine, quite frankly. It just wouldn't exist. And so for me, it's like, it's one of the major things that, Black and brown hands have contributed to the overall cultural history of the country at large is food and actual cuisine. Full stop. And so it's, most people are just like, what? I'm like, between jazz, hip hop, and food, I don't know what you guys would offer the rest of the world. At this point, you don't have much to contribute to a global conversation. So, in that way, what can we, I guess, as a profession, as an industry, start to do? Like, what do you see as kind of the next strategic move? Because, it's on us now to do this period. And so, like, what do you think? What do you see as like the next strategic move that's either already happening or that we do need to actually be making in order to kind of push this activity a little bit harder and find more progress?
Excellent question. Really, I mean, absolutely. The thing that I'm up at night thinking about, and it's sort of central to the way I move through the industry. I'll say this, right? The thing I am most encouraged by is that no systemic change is overnight. And so the perspective of a decade has really been interesting for me, because it's been this notion of these sort of the germs of ideas that I thought I knew intuitively, things I've posited over the years, talking to everybody. I mean, from, I called everybody when I started this thing. I was literally it was 40 people by degrees of separation. Look, I'm in my 20s. I want to do this work seriously. What is going on? Why do we not know who we are? Why do we not? And it was this sort of siren call to just like ring the alarm. I want to know from a Jessica guys. I want to see what Asheville McElveen has to say. I need the elders to tell me what's what. I need to know what to read. And so that starting point 10 years later is looking at to your point about the bookshelf, right? Like I understand and I agree with you to a degree that there's not as much courage in the publishing world to allow voices to just be and allow folks who you might not think represent these foodways. There's this narrative that I think a lot of times media spaces are comfortable with that doesn't allow for an expansive, fully realized, disparate expression of who we are. Because again, Blackness is not a monolithic experience, right? Like you have many, many experiences that sort of encapsulate how you move through the world, and that all has to be thrown up against the wall. It has to all be represented. But I guess I'm encouraged because I look at a time where Jessica Harris's Hound and Hog was literally groundbreaking. It was, to me, one of the only things we had that said the words out loud, that we've been in these streets. Here's the proof, here's the sort of timeline, because after that comes Michael Twitty's Cooking Gene. Then comes Jemima Cole. Tony Sister Martin's got a cookbook campaign to that. I'm looking at JBF last year with Jarrell Guy and her Black Girl Bacon. I'm looking at chefs like Omar Tate, who's working with an agent now, but a book is forthcoming that's going to be multiple disciplines, poetry, drawing, art, like different forms of art, as well as cooking, as well as his personal narrative, memoir as a form. I'm looking at even Kwame, like, you know, you're looking at a book like Notes of a Young Black Chef, or this sort of emblematic moments that book sort of had, like it or not, and sort of critique or not, that book tells a story of his personal narrative that is diasporic. It has his own flavor to it. And
Exactly.
It's going to be a movie. It's going to be, I mean, there's a sense that there's a momentum happening. And so my strategic game plan, at least in the work I'm seeing and what I'm sort of hearing people talk about and seeing in terms of media spaces and terms of publishing, like online publications, magazines, thinking about is, what do you actually have to say? To me, the Times article was absolutely kind of it was a shot across the bow. It was, to me, the complaining I've been hearing from chefs of color saying, you know, oh my goodness, we don't get a chance to tell our stories. There's not opportunities. This was, first of all, a moment where the biggest paper of record is recognizing and reconciling the reality of Black identity in the zeitgeist. But to my mind, and what I'm encouraged by, is that why are we always contorting ourselves to be acceptable, thought of as valuable in mainstream culture? We know we don't. We have the cultural receipt since the birth of this nation. We have the receipts to tell us that we are uniquely American chefs. So the work I think is most interesting is knowing for ourselves the truth. There is not as much as necessary, but there is absolutely scholarship out there in these streets. So why are we not educating ourselves, reading everything possible is out here? So starting from that place, knowing your own, knowing our truth from the start and applying it to your career. Do your work. I want to talk about the dope Johnny Rose in Houston, talking about Eduardo in Seattle, I'm talking about Mashana Bailey in Savannah. If you are in restaurant spaces, do your thing without apology. If you want to write, be Corsha Wilson. Go to publications and pitch these stories that tell about who you are. Publishers, be innovative. On my textbook, it's about to blow y'all's mind. It's not just a cookbook. It's not just memoir. It is breaking form. Look at Lazarus Lynch. His book is gorgeous, and it is he's out here profile style. He's 25 years old. That is what it's going to look like. I think that this sense of being unapologetic about what you have to say as an artist, it's not just coming to the industry because it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry and you can cook. What do you have to say? And if you don't have anything to say, maybe you shouldn't be doing this work. Have something dope to say and just say it. It doesn't have to look like one thing or another. It doesn't have to conform to the old tropes about what's credible in this work. It has to be dope, and it has to be authentic, and it has to be rooted. If you start from that place, I'm telling you, the world has to listen. And we had a moment where all forms of media, all forms of this sort of collective culinary zeitgeist is shifting. The restaurant industry is about to blow up, right? There's this sense that these old models are crumbling around us. We're seeing these old white restaurant groups crumble to the literal ground because they're not built on equity. They're not built in ways that are sustainable. And so while we keep trying to play by these rules that we see aren't valued, aren't equitable, and aren't sustainable, we have the blueprint. We have restaurants that are generational. They may be soul food, but we have the blueprint. Mildred Council, Sylvia, all these restaurateurs understood in the 50s and 60s that we just lost Leah Chase. These restaurants I'm not talking about the foodways. I'm not saying we have to limit ourselves to one particular point of reference. I'm talking about the blueprint for longevity and for the cultural and for the community empowerment. These blueprints are here. We have, before these people, I'm in New York, Norma Darden, Miss Mamie Spoonbread, these people, these women, especially women, but these restaurants, Alexander Smalls, these folks had the blueprint. There's nothing new under the sun. We're not reinventing anything, but there's got to be more sort of generational continuity and more sense that we're not out here making up things as we go along. We literally have the blueprint right here. Why are we not paying attention and using those resources, right? Like when the economy downturn in 2008 and the downturn we're about to see in the next 2 to 5 years, people of color have always been able to weather those storms.
Exactly.
We have to occupy these spaces more responsibly with less resources. So we built for this.
Right.
So why, you know what I mean? Like, there's a sense that we're going to be okay.
Oh yeah. It's funny that idea of understanding that we aren't making things up as we go along. It was because the last interview I did, it hasn't posted just yet, but we were really, I literally was talking about that because it had been sitting with me for a couple of days. This thought of we have not seen ourselves as technicians. We're not represented in general media as technicians, and we definitely don't represent to each other as these kind of detail-driven technicians. And I feel like that just the language of strategy or strategic thinking, this idea of a blueprint, this idea of building on a foundation that is already mapped out. Like that's a very like analytical mindset that's not often celebrated within our community. It's like, no, Black people in general are technicians. We look at finer detail, even though what we present to the public might be big and colorful and loud, and it's grand. It's grand in its presentation. But if you go behind the scenes, there's so much nuance and technique involved in the execution of that you will likely never see unless you know us. And it's funny because like when you started to see the release of like the behind the scenes for like a Beyonce tour or things like that, see how much work she's put in, like the finest detail and those small decisions of what to wear and makeup and hair and how people are standing and formations people are in, and do we put the lift here or do we put the lift over there on the stage, and she's hiring a crew of put lighting together, and when people started to see like there's a level of work to the presentation, and you might look at her performance at Coachella and go, it's huge, it's gigantic, it's like almost overwhelming. But then you look at that behind the scenes and go, but it's sweaty and detailed and nuanced, and she's a technician. And so like that's the thing that people were always trying to reconcile with people like Michael Jackson when they saw him. It was like, no, these guys are technicians. They are extremely skilled in their craft. And, that's another word that doesn't seem to be synonymous with just Black people in general as craftsmen. Like that's just not a word that people use to describe us. And I think because a generation of people have not seen us in that light, we don't approach building these industries in the way we know how to do them from that place. We kind of we look at it from a showmanship side. Like, well, it doesn't look a certain way, so we probably shouldn't do it. And I was like, but the people that we are building the industry on the backs of, the people who have those generational and legacy restaurants that look like us, they are technicians. They look at details in a way that other people don't look at detail. And so at this point for me, I'm just like, how do we shift not the external conversation, but the internal conversation? Like, what do we need to do for ourselves to understand, like, wait a minute, we are fully capable of this. People have done it before us. It's there. And it's not outside of our skill set. Like it's a natural space to think about. I'm like, oh, so think about your grandmom's house or your mom's house and how much detail goes into what they cook, how they decorate, when they execute an event. I'm like, if you've ever been to a Black cookout, a Black wedding, a Black church, there's a lot of detail there. So there's a lot of nuance going into the execution of that. And so for me, I'm like, what does it look like for us to shift the internal conversation? Because I think a lot of it does start there. Like if to your point about if you have something to say it and say it your way. And I think most people are like, but I don't know technically how to get there. I don't know the detail of that. Well, what if I understand the overarching story, but I don't understand how to dial down into the detail. And it's like, I think people don't realize that it's instinctual for us, like if we just turn it on, but I don't know if anyone knows where the light switch is.
It's a fair point. And I think the thing I was most struck by when I started my work was more that, not at all that I think that, intellectual rigor is not critical, because I think that's a central sort of theme that is not missing, but is really the secret sauce. There's a degree of rigor that needs to be infused into the work we do. To your point about technical excellence and those notions of how we make magic happen and make it look easy. That's a really, I think that's a generational thing as well. That is something I've been really pondering. I think about the Anna Lewis's. I think about the restaurateurs like the Alexander Smalls. I think about Patrick Clark a lot recently. And I think that there's a sense that because they didn't show their work, they didn't show the legwork, because we don't have a lot of times with the elders that have passed, because we weren't having, like you said, the strategic conversation about what it was really going to take to do work on their level. There's a sense that, and it may be an affectation of this generation. I don't know what the disconnect is, but this sense that, oh, this is just intuitive. We just out here, like, you get your degree from culinary school. You want to cook, so you're going to do it, and just do a pop of whatever, and it's just gonna be hot. No. There is literally
Sorry. Okay.
There's a sense of the only way I have to say this is a rigor, intellectual rigor that goes into
Absolutely.
what you're saying your craft is. If you're saying that you are. We throw around the word chef a lot. We use that word really freely. And if you are really doing this work, if you're really about this life, what does that mean for you? What are you reading? What are you investing in? How are you reinvesting in yourself professionally? What are you doing that makes you, like, what's your legwork? What's your Beyonce level swag? What are you doing? How are you out here making sure that what you're putting out into the world, what you have to say as a credible working chef in the tradition of James Hemmings, in the tradition of Hercules, in the tradition of Patrick Clark, in the tradition of Edna Lewis, if you have that legacy behind you, literally right there for you to absorb and to look at and to sort of be inspired by, if that's what you're saying you do, what's your practice? What's the level of intellectual rigor that you are infusing into your work? And that doesn't have to look like one thing, but it should be rigorous. Right. It should be intensive. It should be, and I don't know how, like literally there, I say it's 200 books you should be reading. It's, 18-year-olds, when I say 40% of the emails I get from my website, our parents wanted me to talk to their young people about coming to this industry. Wow. I'm like, yes, free culinary school student. I need you to read Taste the Country Listen first. I need you to read Vernon McGrosen first. I need you to understand the subversive dopeness of Vertimae Grosvenor before I can talk to you about why you want to come to this work. I need you to have reference points. I need you to know why you want to come to this work. I'm not saying you need to know what the long game is for you, but what's the spark of inspiration? Because if you could think of anything else to do in this, other than come into this industry, do that first, because it's not a game. And it's too much. It's too many lives lost. It's too many lives marginalized. It's too many lives overlooked. It's too much intellectual rigor that's been ignored and sort of overlooked in a way that sort of, like you said, dismisses the strategic and technical excellence to just have you out here playing. And so, to my mind, it looks like what do you have to say? What does that look like? And what work are you putting into? I mean, because I'm telling you that the moment you can't read travel notes without knowing for sure that we don't have to play by anybody else's rules. Vertimae was geeky to her soul and was 18 in a moment where, she had watched Josephine Baker go abroad. She had Baldwin as her reference. And she said, I know what's fly. I know what I am. I know what our foodways are. What's the rest of why doesn't anybody else know? What's the rest of the world have that's better than what we have? And so she traveled. She got on a boat in the days when you did that. She didn't come north. She went east. Like she went to travel through France and through London and wanted to know what was so delicious, what this cuisine that we're saying is better than, is more elite than. She's like, that's nothing but what we have back home, and we do it better, and it tastes and it's dope. And she came home, and she was one of our first calling anthropologists. But that takes a degree of faith and like belief in the power of our culture. And it's the starting point that, to me, in my own experience, says that if you center us, you center our culture, you center who we are as people, not exclusively, there's absolutely room for exploration, room for play, room for cooking, whatever you want to cook. But if you start from a place that recognizes the power of who we are from a cultural point of reference, and that's a central thing. That's where you start from. That's what Beyonce, the power. You brought Beyonce up, but like I think that's a prime example. But there's a lot of investment in her. There's things like there's money invested, there's time invested, there's an intellectual rigor to what she does in the world that does not pay fiscal dividend in the way that it looks traditionally like it should. But it's investment in the power of the imagery, right? There's restaurant groups like Edward Jordan. To my mind, he's the restaurateur we should be looking at. Michelle Bailey, a restaurateur we should be looking at. That have restaurants that are 3 and 5 years in, that are showing equitable growth. They're showing how you maintain your brand, not just as a flash in the pan, but as a brand that is fostering young people, fostering this next generation of cooks. It's showing you how to be in these streets, rooted, but also viable, right?
Exactly.
It's about sort of not having to play by other people's rules, but knowing that we have our own. If you literally just start from a place of centeredness and start from whatever your passion, that German passion is for you, starting from there and growing equitably outward. That's the secret sauce, man. Like that's the big one.
Definitely. And I love the word you used was practice. And when we look at certain professions like medicine and a few and law, the word practice is applied to the professional, not just the student, but at the professional level, at the person who's actively working in that field they refer to what they do as a practice. And so to apply that to this conversation I think it feels like it, that committing yourself to furthering your own education and absorbing the work that's already done, reading the books, it creates a holistic point of view. It's not just looking at I'm going to be in this restaurant, I'm going to cook these few, make these plates, put them out and go home for the night. It creates an entire world view around what you do. And I feel like what happens is people are still kind of in that space of, well, I just need a job and this is the quickest way to make that happen. If I don't feel like I'm suited for necessarily a traditional college classroom, and I don't necessarily want any of these other jobs, but I need to do something with myself. So I'm gonna just go ahead and do this because it's a job. And it's like, well, there's a point where you have to make a decision about who you're going to be, even in that. It's, I'm like, are you going to just work? Are you going to become a craftsman? Are you going to apply yourself to the practice? Because once you decide to become a practitioner, you do become a bit more aggressive about looking for information. As long as you're just working to get by, you don't really think of it. There's no priority to that. But the minute you decide to be a practitioner and a craftsman, you're just like, okay, so what else don't I know? What else could I know? Where is this information available to me? And so you pursue it relentlessly. You have an insatiable appetite for it. It's like, okay, so what more can I go do? What more can I find? Who else can I talk to? What other voices exist? Even the ones in opposition to mine.
Especially the ones opposite.
Come on, because it's only going to sharpen who you are, your skill, and your point of view. I'm like, because anything that can challenge, okay, what do I currently believe about what I do and the effects of what I do? I remember a few weeks back, I was thinking about, because like my current day job, I am a city manager for a corporate caterer right now. And I was looking at the work of a caterer because it's such an interesting position to play in the food industry and feed large numbers of people in a very short amount of time in a very organized, methodical fashion. It takes a lot. It's a different skill set for sure. And a lot of people are not suited for it. They can do one plate at a time, but to really execute a catered service it's an orchestra. And so I was looking at what we do, and I was like, past that, past the technical side of that and the practical side of it, what we do is, for me, I think one of the noblest things any human being can do, feed somebody. And looking at it in the context of when I worked in Philadelphia, I worked for a nonprofit that would revamp school lunch programs. And we did it within the parameters of the National School Lunch Program, and understanding the details and still trying to provide a nutritious, interesting meal for young people so that they felt that they were important. Because people just fail to recognize that feeding somebody really speaks to them about how you feel about them directly. And so, having the privilege of serving these kids, and then, a few years later, sitting in this position, and I'm feeding working adults at their jobs, but the same thought was triggered. I was like, a lot of the kids would come to school and the meal we served them was the only meal they were going to get that day. And then looking at the challenges of food inequality, malnutrition, just a lack of resource for a lot of families to feed themselves. How many parents are going hungry to make sure they can feed their kids? And I just thought about the number of adults we feed in a workplace at their desk. I don't know how many of those adults this is the only meal they're going to get that day. Because of the circumstances that they're in. And I'm just like, the work is noble, and up to this point, it's really not treated as such. It's not, it used to be, it was an honorable profession. I'm like, but are you really understanding? Like, someone's giving you an opportunity to offer them something that they put in their bodies. That's a weighty responsibility, and it deserves your time and attention to educate yourself. It deserves your interest. It deserves your commitment to continue to find new conversations and new sources of information because it's just so important. Like the things we put in the body fuel life. And so if you're jumping into this profession because it's like, I just need something to do, you need to like you said, you need to reevaluate, maybe take a step back and decide if this is really what you want to do.
Yep. I'm to your point about even just sort of you think about school lunch program. I mean, we don't have a school lunch program without the Panthers, right? Like we dismiss the reach of the Black Panther Party. What I meant about blueprint earlier was also that it's disparate disciplines to give us culinary blueprint. You're talking about women like Georgia Gilmore who club from nowhere, sort of backdoor restaurants during the civil rights movement. With these women who were domestics, were cooks in college cafeterias, but also the restaurants of the day who were, back in the days when Black and brown people, specifically women, were really the culinary workforce and the lifeblood of this country. They literally fed the civil rights era. But then the Panthers come along. They're our first school lunch program. They understood the power of food as resistance. They understood that they give us the blueprint for our current school lunch program. But when you look back at somebody like Rashid Nuri, who was in agriculture at the time, he's responsible for their growing program. It wasn't just free lunch. It wasn't just a free lunch program. It was a network of Black farmers and urban agriculturalists who were feeding communities across the country outside of rural agricultural spaces. So this conversation we have, and I think currently about what Black foodways look like, what it means to be a Black chef, has to be multidisciplinary. And the intellectual rigor I'm talking about as well is not just about the books you're reading, but where you source the ingredients. Karen Washington, Black Farmers and Urban Gardens Association, is literally a network of national Black farmers who are in your community now, who have the microgreens, have the small produce. Why I live in East Harlem. 8 years of catering at East Harlem, not realizing there were 8 other women of color operating small-based food businesses in my community. Why weren't we buying as a CSA all of our produce? Why weren't we thinking more strategically about how we were engaging the Black farming community? Thinking about people like Monica White and Leah Penniman have 2 recent books about the sort of subversive power of Black farming. These are other blueprints that sort of give us life and give us tools to use in our community, sort of show us about cooperative and the power of collective resources that is going to take sort of thinking more broadly about how our practices, but also how we navigate the food space, because it's going to take disruption. It's going to take thinking outside the box in lots of ways about how we run restaurants, how we navigate our catering careers, what the pop-up space looks like, what we educate, it's all these things. And so back to your point about the point thing earlier about academic rigor or intellectual rigor, it's about this rabbit hole. Once you start, you can't unknow the truth, right? You can't. And so there's this sense of it's not. I don't think that it's not one. There's not one line, there's not a checklist of things anybody is doing. It's literally just a start. It starts from someplace, right? Because this rabbit hole will get you and lead you to everything else. Black Farmers Conference, I'm telling you that I every year wish that more Black chefs would be there in that room. Because it takes, I think, a lot of times in these silos, right? The Black arts movement, in our other artistic disciplines, Black advertising, all these other Black spaces are having these professional conversations similar to the one we're having. Everybody's having the same circular conversation, not realizing that if we were all in the same place at the same time, cross disciplines, we would be able to share best practices in a way that would feed everybody's work. I don't know if you know Colleen Vincent, but she and Clay Williams have an organization called Black Food Folk. And it literally is grown out of, we were all in New Orleans, maybe, I feel like it would have been last October at this point. The Howard Kanye's Gotta Fall Down for this thing called Gumbo Jubilee. And we're all in the same place, and it's a sense of just show up for each other. Literally just show up. It doesn't have to be it's not about clicks, it's not about it's about being in one place, celebrating us across the country. It should be consistent and continuous. And so he wanted to do whole cow barbecue because traditionally Black pitmasters would cook a whole cow, but would never get to consume it because if you have a whole cow, you're not gonna. That's an expensive animal. It's a lot. And so to do whole cow barbecue was sort of a reclamation. It's sort of sense that like we're gonna have these black chefs, these black food folks in one place having a celebratory sort of like ritualistic meal in the heart of New Orleans. We got to sit with Leah Chase, and she's telling, just giving us these pearls. And so we all got back from this beautiful weekend, and there was this sense of just like, why does everything have to be so complicated? Literally just get home and just see. And so Black Food Folks is literally just about these like sort of talkbacks around the country. It should, if you whatever city you in, it could just look like a Monday evening in a restaurant that's already slow. Ring the bat signal, ring the alarm, and get everybody down in one room. They don't have to just be chefs. It should be educated. It should be artists. It should be just be in the same room. You don't know what resources you have community-wise. We keep pretending like we don't have community. We have. You understand how dope we are. But we have people with so many different disciplines. Just be in the same room. You don't know what you're working on that you need a fresh set of eyes for. You don't know what you want to do. Here's the dope, cinematographer, photographer. Here's the people on production side. Here's the folks who been through the sort of media training. Here's the folks who have cookbooks. Everybody in the same room. What are you working on? Black Food Folks events are literally just everybody in the same room. What are you working on? What do you have to offer the collective in terms of your expertise and resources? What do you need from the collective? As simple as that.
I know that it's for me, that idea of asking the right question will send you down that rabbit hole. I think that a lot of people, they just aren't curious enough. And, even if you simply start with the question, not so much are we dope, but how dope are we? And you seek to answer that question, the rabbit hole is infinite. Like, you can keep going down that sucker for a long, long time and not outrun the information, because it'll always take you to a place that will surprise you. And so for me, I'm just like, to start asking that question more frequently, that how dope are we? How deep does the well go? And because there's so much information down there, and I'm like that curiosity will drive. I mean, for me, I make almost all of my decisions about life and career based on that. I'm driven by my curiosity. What questions can I ask? What questions can I answer? Because you'll always unfold more. And you can't. I always tell people, you can't outrun your curiosity. As long as you turn that bad boy on, it'll keep pushing you into new places that you haven't been before, that are going to be uncomfortable, that will surprise you, that will challenge you, and that's how you do that. And so for me, I'm like, can we, as a community, because you're right, we do have community. I think that we have allowed outside messages to seep in and inform our thinking as a collective. It's like, no, we have community. It's just an automatic. Black people create community wherever we are in a space. If you go to a conference for anything and there's 4 Black people in the room, if everybody is on it, you will find a community. And it's like, that's just what we do. We do it for other people. It's not even just each other. If you're in, wherever we are, we will create a sense of community among whoever's with us. And I think that's one of the major appeals of Black people overall in general, is this idea that we spark community and inspire community no matter where we go and no matter who we're with. Because people, they're some of the best people I know. And it's just like, I know it's because we invite you and welcome you into this space as a member of the community. So, go ahead.
Thank you. Yep. I think sometimes too, we think about our restaurant, like, there's this moment we're having where I think, I don't know, because we have lots of like sort of cliche kind of sentiments about like setting the seats at tables and all of this. And I think that the thing that I've been most interested in is not even like the sort of, I build my own table, I don't need to, I'm flip it, but it's mostly about, like you said, Black spaces are always inclusive, right? Like the way we build community, the way we navigate through the world, we don't have a luxury of exclusivity. And like when we are out here in resistance spaces and just in the way we have to move through the world, like our narratives automatically benefit everybody else, right? And so it's a lot of like there's a lot of emotional and like a lot of just there's a lot of trauma is not the right word, but it takes a lot. You know,
Absolutely.
It takes a lot of energy to navigate the world as a Black person, and there's a lot of times in the work that we do that we are innately thinking about and thinking strategically about being inclusive, right? Like we have to integrate spaces and sort of navigate mainly white spaces all the time. And so there's a fatigue that comes from that. And I think that we also don't like acknowledge that fatigue sometimes. I think that we, because we always on hustle mode, because we always in spaces where we have to be hyper aware and be dexterous and be, you know, that we don't recognize the like. I mean, it's a tool, and I've chosen to look at it as a tool that we have innately. That like because we have to be so dexterous, we have the ability to adjust to trauma and like to economic downturns or challenges. We built in a way that makes us more prepared than our counterparts to just be out in these streets and hustle. And that's a good thing, but it's also an exhausting thing. And I think that we should be more gentle with ourselves in the recognition of that fact, because I think that some of the collective breath we have or some of the frustration folks have, they just want to take a breath. They just want to navigate things like everybody else and not have to everything be on a 100, you know, why does it gotta be 100? What if when it turns to everybody else is just fine? And so my like utopia would be a day when we can like, you know, sort of navigate in a more gentle way. And also the thing you said about community is so interesting, because I'm always concerned when I hear especially Black chefs say people don't support them, or so we don't have community. And I wonder sometimes about how we qualify that. What showing up for you looks like. So lots of times I think that we aren't specific in what we ask for, what we need from community. And it's a hard thing to know what you need. Like I said, we operate from a place of hustle and operate from a place of like just exhaustion and sort of this hamster wheel that seems to be perpetual, and you don't seem to have traction in the work you're doing, whatever. And I get the frustration of that. I do. I'm not like, I just choose positivity in general. But I think the interesting posture change would be to really be clear about what you want and need from community, right? Like, and if you don't see the community that you want, build it, right? But there's this sense that like, I don't know, every time I hear a chef say, especially a Black chef, and again, like the work I do is all about community, right? I'm in these different circles and I hear it sometimes folks lament, Black folks don't support X, Y, Z. And I get that. I'm not suggesting that those realities aren't there. What I'm saying is you can't control what other folks do, right? You can't control really anything except how you move through the world. And so to my mind, there's lots of times where community showing up for you might not look like what you think it should look like, but there's absolutely resources that you're not tapping because you haven't recalibrated what showing up looks like. And so thinking more broadly about what support and community looks like, what you really need to do the work you want to do, and recalibrate expectations. Because I think that there's a lot of negative energy gets placed into antiquated notions of support and community, that if you had looked or shifted resources a little bit, your thought process a little bit, you recognize you really do have. I'm looking at people like Ben Burkett, like Black farmers, to me, have some of the most grassroots, most entrenched, most culturally significant collective communities. And they do it because they recognize that we out here alone and we have to support one another. We have to be invested in everybody's like all boats rises kind of thing. And I think it's very easy to get mired in the superficiality sometimes of the culinary space.
Absolutely.
And not really recognize that like community has to look different for us. It's got to be more entrenched. And if we sort of just make that sort of posture change, that recalibration, all of a sudden you recognize the power of what you really do have in community, and just that sort of recalibration of expectations would change a lot of the narratives that aren't really particularly productive.
It's true. And I've been kind of exploring that question about, support, and what does support look like for people in across all industries, especially Black people, when you do have this idea of, and I see it all the time, on Instagram feeds and in social media spaces and stuff about Black people, buy Black, you need to make sure you support Black businesses. And while the sentiment is absolutely necessary and true, and we are in a unique position where we actually do have to say it because we aren't the economical default as far as, or the commerce default as far as where people purchase, what people purchase, and who they purchase from. We do have to make a kind of a specific request of each other to make sure that we are putting our dollars in certain places. And I'm always curious, like you said, when you're talking about I don't have their support, are we talking about monetarily? Are we talking about you just don't feel like people are showing up for you physically, like they're not present? I know for me, a lot of conversations fall into kind of a fiscal conversation. Well, where's the money? I hear you say you support me. I hear you say you love the product or the service or, whatever I'm doing, but you're not purchasing anything. You're not, and I think the thing we have to understand is just because someone's spending money on something doesn't necessarily mean they support it. And doesn't necessarily mean they love it, So it's like, dollars are not an automatic confirmation of the quality of anything. And so for me, there's, I also feel like you out here buying car insurance, but you're not a big fan of car insurance because it's taken from your budget where you might spend money elsewhere. We spend money on a lot of things we don't necessarily like, but are essential to life. So, when I talk to people about, asking for fiscal and financial support, I'm like, it has to look different because, as we know in the restaurant industry and in the food industry, it's an exchange of value. I'm paying you for something that I value equally. That's why, so when I talk to people, even in general, like when I run into a stranger or I'm standing in line at a grocery store or at a restaurant and I overhear a conversation about, oh my gosh, I can't believe that cost that much. Why would they even charge that much for like a plate of chicken or whatever? And understanding that on the other side, I have had to sit down and look at a food budget and figure out how to cost out a meal and how much am I going to pay for this particular product, and then how much of that cost am I going to extend to the diner. And so, I think people have to be very transparent about what it looks like. And like you said earlier, what does it look like to really do this? Like, I think we have created a culture of you don't have any details, which gives people a false sense of success. So you have things like, American Idol and The Voice and Chopped, and a lot of like the competition shows kind of lend themselves to this thinking that people watch, the audience watches, they see the kind of the finished product and go, well, I can do that. It don't take all, that's all it takes to get that far. That's all it takes to do so-and-so, stand in line for an audition or submit an application and then get casted. And I'm like, okay, so we've created this, this space and culture where it's like you lose, there's a lack of respect for how hard something actually is and how much is invested and how much you pour into and how much of yourself you give to something to see it work. Because on the opposite end of that, you do see restaurants shuttering and closing down, and you're just like, that restaurant's been around forever, or this this particular store has been open for for a decade or more, and now all of a sudden it's closing. And so we do have this what's the word, kind of expendable energy around things that people work really, really hard to execute. And so we've created this kind of reductive attitude towards so many things at this point, and that includes food. And like the current fight between, who has the best chicken sandwich, Chick-fil-A or Popeyes. And I'm like, do you know how many small little Black restaurants out there make better chicken sandwiches than both of them? Like, for real, y'all. Is this what we're doing? Like, is this where you want the narrative to go? Because like a fried chicken sandwich is an easy narrative for Black people to come into and really bust that discussion up quite a bit. It's like, well, y'all can continue with this argument between both of these white-owned chain restaurants about their chicken sandwich, and we'll be over here talking about actual real chicken sandwiches. Like, when you're ready to actually talk about it, come see us. But it's a conversation like that we just kind of feed commercially. And I'm just like, but this is one of them really great conversations that can turn into a large discussion about how we view what's good, what tastes good, what actually is good. And it's like, don't shy away from those kind of conversations. I'm like, you letting people who don't believe in salt and pepper talk about chicken sandwiches right now. And it's a conversation we should be a part of.
Well, so here's the thing, right? Like, I've been thinking recently a lot. I'm working on my first book proposal, and there's a whole section I have around soul food, right? And there's this conversation we have around Black foodways where there were chefs 10 years ago who wouldn't even talk to me about Black identity in our work. They were chefs first. I'm out here. I'm cooking cuisine, and I'm not Black. I'm not Black first. I'm a chef first, and there's no place essentially for Black identity, right? Those same chefs, a lot of them are out here, all of a sudden recognizing the power of Black cuisine. And people's journeys are what they are, and they, I think people come to the reality of the power of our culture when they're ready. But I say all to say, I've been thinking a lot recently about soul food restaurants. To my mind, I live in Harlem, right? I live in East Harlem, but, sort of Harlem soul food is kind of ubiquitous. On Sunday mornings, you can't walk through the West Side without tripping over white folks coming up on the tour buses wanting to see the gospel. Abyssinia Baptist Church has to have a separate service so that the tourists can kind of come and experience gospel tradition, the gospel brunch. Just these institutions that are Harlem-based that are kind of the bedrock of the sort of soul food, Black foodways narrative born out of the 60s, right? And so I look at a restaurant like Sylvia's. I'm not calling anybody out, but I'm looking at sort of soul food restaurants that are iconic, but are maybe not as modern as they should be, right? They could be, and aren't able to, and are maybe trying to compete with the modern culinary zeitgeist, and it's not a comparable fight. To my mind, soul food restaurants are sort of public trust, but the power of that public trust is they're like a historic financial business blueprint, right? The people like Sylvia Woods, the reason Sylvia's is still standing, still operating, is because Miss Woods understood the power of real estate. She owns that block. So Sylvia's going to be in that spot, regardless of what you think about the city, because that building is hers. That family understands the power of that real estate, right? I look at someone like Moja Council. We lost 2 years ago, Miss Council. She started her Mama Dib's restaurant in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She started her restaurant with like $43 for lunch, turned that profit and made dinner. And so this restaurant is built and sort of maintained through this notion of manageable, reasonable, equitable expectation and reinvesting in self. Right? There are soul restaurants all around the country that are changing hands generationally, but maybe aren't changing hands generationally. You're seeing our culture shudder. You're seeing this history shudder because we didn't see the power in generational memory. We don't require more of, we don't pay what is fair for the rising cost of food. Soul food Black foodways, whatever you want to call it, our food culture is so entrenched in how and who we are and how we were brought up. So you see people, I'm not paying X, Y, and Z for this, whatever. And that's a fair. There's a fair part of the conversation that requires more of our restaurants, requires more of our foodways. Asks that we think more broadly about modernizing this cuisine. And so for every Sylvia's, every community soul food restaurant, there's a nouveau soul, sort of modern soul food restaurant.
Right,
and
right.
I'm not saying I have a problem with modern soul food. What I have a problem with is this idea of elevation when we're not sort of rooted in history. And so
right.
I say all of that to say that I think a lot of times we have these conversations about our foodways collectively and what we're going to invest in, what we pay our dollars for, not recognizing that in lots of ways, we don't do justice to the what it really takes to maintain these businesses, generational businesses that probably were struggling through, that are trying to compete in a moment that is a wildly, vastly different environment than they were when they opened. These restaurants that didn't have to contend with the, sort of greasy, slimy narrative around real estate schemes and all of this. So many communities from Detroit to Chicago to Oakland to Atlanta. The conversation that restaurateurs are having to contend with around just opening your doors, just paying people a living wage, all those elements go into what we pay for our foodways. And so many people of color aren't willing to recognize the fact that our restaurants have to be a public trust. There
Absolutely.
has to be a sense of, sort of the recognition of what it really takes to open these restaurants and be sustainable. Why a lot of our restaurants are fast casual, not the rarefied air, right? Restaurants like 11 Madison Park and Per Se and French Laundry and Elenia, they're charging you these insane prices and without qualification. They know they set the tone for how the public engages their cuisine, their what they do as a brand. But even those models aren't necessarily equitable. New York City right now, hotel line cooks make like $35, $36 an hour. The cooks at Per Se make $18. How is that? You know what I mean? Like that. There's a real talk conversation that we're not being honest about when it comes to what it really takes to be in a restaurant space, because some of this stuff has nothing to do with food. It has nothing to do with what you cook as a professional tactician, right? Like before you even get a chance to define cuisine, you have to have your doors open, and all of that is those things that have nothing to do with how talented you are, anything. And then, so if you see a restaurant who actually has their doors open and actually is trying to present to the public what they do, what they have to say, but then you have to contend with folks not even wanting to pay the dollars because it's just soul food. That's a conversation that we need to be more honest about, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I remember when Anthony Bourdain had sparked a very interesting conversation about, for lack of a better term, ethnic food in this country, and why people believe, Mexican food should be cheap or Chinese food should be cheap. And it was just like, you just go ahead and throw soul food in there too. And and again, it's really a perception versus reality thing, because all of those restaurants and all of them are businesses first. Yep. And, I told them, like, it's a business first and foremost, and it just depends on what your final product, what your end user product is going to be. Some people sell websites, some people sell shoes, restaurants sell food, but it's still a practice. It's still a practice of business there. And so to understand that no one's out here doing this for their health, they got employees to pay, a building to maintain, licenses to pay for it. Because if none of those things were in place, your experience in that place would be subpar. And so it's like, you want a restaurant to have a good health rating. That requires cleaning products, that requires a dish crew, that requires that people are trained in food safety, which costs money. Like people don't understand that it is a business first. And you can't even open your doors unless all of those things are in place. And most of the time, like most businesses, you spend the first few years just paying those debts back to get yourself, to get those stores open. There's no profitability there. It takes 3 to 4 years to actually be profitable. And then when it comes to, it's interesting that there's like the couple of interviews I've done with people, with the ladies who work in wine and who work in wine space, either as producers or sellers or educators. We've talked a lot about legacy and about how wine is one of those very unique businesses that are generational intentionally, and it's rare that you see that in other industries. And so, but it's also, wine is a product that grows in value the older it gets. And as a Black nation, as a Black community, we haven't had a conversation around what are we going to value in that way? What is it that we do and offer to the rest of the world that we can tell the rest of the world that as this gets older, it gets more expensive because it has more value? And we don't have conversations about that because because then we have to be honest about about how we spend our money, and the fact that the Black dollar only stays in the community for less than 2 hours. And the fact that so then we'd have to have a real honest conversation with each other about, okay, this is what we're doing. And these are the behaviors we're engaged in right now. So we really won't be able to sustain our ideals if we don't change our behavior and shift our thinking about them. Amen. So, well, go ahead.
No, just because I think the other thing too, like to the point I was making earlier about like disparate disciplines, right? Like it's even just in sort of the food and beverage space, right? Like I think that it's so important that chefs and farmers and winemakers and beer, brewmasters, everybody needs to be in the same room, right? Because to your point about generational baton pass and sort of the power of generation, the power of like blueprint and continuity, like these are conversations that I think restaurateurs would just think about. People like Mac McDonald and sort of Black Vendors Association and just African American Vendors Association and just all these like spaces where we were always the only, but we had to create community. Like in the wine world, like what they did with Mac McDonald and those guys did with African American Vendors Association was essentially say we should be in these wine streets, and we want to make sure that we have a collective that shares resources and makes us a player in Sonoma, just like the white boys, just like these other folks. And I mean, I just think that just this idea of we were talking about earlier, just this notion of we have community-based resources. We have blueprints for how to build longevity and community. They might not look like or might not be in the space that you think they're going to be in, but they I mean, like you said, just paying attention to wine folks. There's a young lady named Ashton Berry, and we went down for her resistance. She and Kasira Hill have an organization called Radical Exchange. And he did a conference called Resistance Served during this last February. And these young women in the beverage space, bartenders, liquor ambassadors, show like a lot of like establishment food folks the power of the liquor space and the resources that liquor sponsorship and wine sponsorship have to get things you want to get done, right? Like we don't think about the sort of dexterity that the wine and spirit side has because of different financial models, right? Like there's this sense to look at the collective in Detroit, Fort, that is a restaurant, bar. I think they have like a grocery store. Like these four women had across their business, their two sets of businesses were occupying the food space in disparate disciplines and collectively form this organization that thinks more broadly about how to navigate all those spaces, because you're looking at best practices from all these different points of view, right? Like we need best practices from the wine folks to show us how to have better practices in our restaurants. We need the chefs to sort of be the eyes to kind of identity in our work for wine folks. I think that there's just so much knowledge
exactly
and best practices.
Because it's like, otherwise, how do you grow? How do you grow?
Just look or thought more
if you
broadly
just
about
talking
what
to
can
yourself.
like,
Anyway,
and using disciplines that don't necessarily match
you
up
see me,
with
I'm
what
like,
you
with these last few minutes, even though we about 30 minutes over what I usually tell people. I'm like, I usually go an hour, but I think my last two interviews we've gone one went like an hour and 45, and then the other one I just had to stop, and then we just kept talking for 2.5 hours. So with the last few moments, what I would love to hear from you, and what I would love to get after the show really is like, if you can drop me a list of a lot of those books that you referenced today, so we can just link them in the description, link them on the page with the podcast itself, so people can go. But what are the top? I would say, because 3 seems tight. Give me 5 books that people need to purchase and read just within the next season, like for people to put on their reading list, to get on their Audible, like however they're absorbing this information right now. What are 5 books that people just need to get in their life right now to help them kind of start to shift their thinking about Black food, Black foodways, and Black food business?
Okay, so for me, I am Edna Lewis biographer. I think that she is so critical to the way we think about identity in this work. And taste is of country cooking is absolutely iconic. But I actually wish that and hope that people think about Verda Mae Grosvenor. She passed away 3 or 4 years ago at this point, and I think that she was a lot of things, but the main sort of function of her writing was as a culinary anthropologist. And Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl is to me Notes of a Native Son. It's the sort of the agency and sort of the autonomy she had in her writing, the sort of centeredness in terms of Blackness that she had in the way she engaged her writing, the artistic disciplines she brought to her recipes in that book. Just to me, like, they kick doors in. It literally says, like, I'm Geechee to my soul, and that's dope enough. Like, you're welcome for me sharing it with you. How amazing it is to be Black in this country, and here's why our foodways are delicious and dope, and you should pay attention. So Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl, Verda Mae Grosvenor, iconic book. And it was written in the same generation as Taste of Country Cooking. So either one of those, but I would start with Verda Mae. If you read that book, you can't unknow Verda Mae. And so I think to then transition into Jessica Harris's Hound the Hog becomes critical, because Dr. Harris has given us a 13-chapter dissertation on the sort of progression and truth of the Black hands in American foodways. She gives us these stories and these sort of these narratives that give you perfect context for what our legacy in American foodways really is. And it's a completely underrated book. Folks don't pay not nearly enough attention to it, but it is absolutely iconic, and it does sort of give you a fair and balanced base of knowledge to sort of think about our identity in American foodways. If you read those 2 things, then you be ready to think about personal narrative. And so I think Michael Twitty's The Cooking Gene is critical, because he's giving you the diaspora. He's thinking about not just the enslaved experience, but these reference points from the continent, and what the enslaved have to give us and tell us about dignity and about place and like sort of agency in an institution that I think get marginalized in ways that aren't healthy or honest. The enslaved experience is really the birth of our culinary identity, and I think that you can't look at what his practice and what he does in the zeitgeist clearly, unless you really understand why he's on these plantations and why he's picking cotton from cane seed to cane seed. There's a a culinary authority that comes from your life depending on whether your fire is sustainable, whether your bread rises. You don't have a choice to not be culinarily excellent if you are an enslaved chef. And not to suggest, I mean, there's a narrative around our foodways that is always about deprivation, always about the making something out of nothing. It can't, but there's it's never juxtaposed with the black bottom truth that if you were an enslaved cook, if you post-emancipation are a domestic worker before this profession was legitimized in the eyes of the country, before we had restaurants, it was black and brown chefs from Haiti and Africa and the whole of the Caribbean and the American South who gave America its credibility as a culinary juggernaut. If you were setting the finest tables of the day before 1977, it was a black hand that was giving your table its authority. And so I think what Michael's work does and what his book did is really sort of set the tone for this notion of reframing the enslaved experience, but reframing Black identity in America, and sort of saying, like, you have to turn these old white tropes on their heads, because the ancestors were subversive. They were wily, they were brilliant, and the narrative is always framed in a way that diminishes their humanity, but also diminishes this like full-on dopeness. If you read those three, then I think that for reference, you have to go to the Jemima Code. Tony Tipton Martin gave us this gorgeous James Beard Award-winning coffee table book that is all about dignity. Toni Tipton Martin is completely underrated food historian, food figure. She was a journalist first. She was one of the first food editors before that was a thing. Food editors of color. She was at the LA Times when Ruth Rachel came, so that heyday of the sort of emerging food media. And she's young enough to have been in those rooms with Ed Lewis and founding member of SSA and all these things, right? And so her career had been about wanting to see her grandmother, wanting to see our heritage represented. Like, telling your story in your voice. So as a journalist, she basically just really got on her beat, and she's collected 300 plus cookbooks, 200 years of history. And so Jemima Code becomes this heirloom. It becomes this sort of beautiful, tactile, stunningly shot reference for these 200 years of receipts. We have culinary receipts out here, and I think the Jemima Code does beautifully what we really need as a community to sort of say, like, here are the books, here from Rufus Estes to John Dabney to Princess Pamela to Ty Richards and J.J. Johnson. There's this continuum of Black excellence, Black dopeness, and here the receipts. I think that it's a book that I continue to go back to because it sort of showcases the fact that food media, as it's been emerging, had always had Black and brown people. You got Carson Gully in the Midwest. There were these examples in times where narratives are relatively limited that prove that Black and brown people have been in these streets. But it's very easy to, the history belongs to the people who tell stories. And so when we allow mainstream media to tell our narratives in ways that dismiss us, it does a disservice to the legacy that we sort of have really died for, test for. I think a modern book that I think is really interesting that I wish, I hope that more people look at is Lazarus Lynch's Son of a Southern Chef. Lazarus is 25 years old, and to be 25, he's actually put in over a decade of work, right? He went to Food and Finance High School here in the city, which is, I mean, in lots of ways better than some culinary schools around the country. But he is so fully formed as a person. He knows exactly who he is. He knows exactly where he comes from. He knows what his aesthetics are. And he's been able to navigate and break through traditional media in ways that I think it's kind of a masterclass in kicking these people's doors and taking their resources and turning them on their heads. Food Network, I think, gets a lot of critique. I don't necessarily consume it, but I consume him. And I think that he shows us I'm 38, and I think the lessons I've learned from watching him navigate through his media journey, especially, has been about agency, right? Like if you enter a space centering your own point of view and are unwilling to compromise, we're in a moment where not just Black culture, but authenticity and sort of clarity of voice is sexy, is marketable. And the moment we're having around Black foodways is not a fad. I mean, our culture, our foodways aren't a fad, but there's a fetishization, I think, sometimes of Blackness, and like you said, the thing about our culture always being hot. It absolutely is, because we taste makers, right? But I think the danger sometimes is not sort of being rigorous. And Lazarus, it may look fly, it may look like he out here thirst trapping and he got his Instagram, got him half naked and doing all kinds of, you out here with Vogue shoots and whatnot. But don't let the Instagram fool you, because there is a rigor to the way his personal presentation is setting the tone for how media and how the public engages his work. And so to me, that's subversive. That's the blueprint, right? That's part of the best practices that I think if more chefs of color specifically we're looking at, would sort of empower folks to just sort of, what the hell do you have to say? Like, unless you guys, you don't have to. It doesn't have to be about bombast or boast. It's got to be what are you out here saying? And it should be fully formed, and it could look like anything. But Lazarus, I think it gives me. It's like when I look at him, I know we're gonna be all right, because I know that this is what the future looks like. It looks like telling your story in ways that just sort of demand attention. Yes. All you got. It's as simple as, it sounds so simple, and people but they overlook the power of simplicity. What do you have? How do you say? If you just concentrate on that, like you said, that's a rabbit hole you would be consumed with. Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. And it stops. I used to get not frustrated, but I used to get nervous when you get that deer in the headlights. That like, oh, because I think that people don't ask that question enough, right? We don't require much of young people. This sense that you just go to culinary school because that stands for food, go through your externship and go out to industry, that is not rigorous. That is not for anybody, not just chefs of color, but young people of color. It's anybody, but especially out. Why aren't we requiring? There's got to be, and I'm not talking about barriers to entry. I'm talking about requirement of your place in this industry. There was a requirement for Georgia Gilmore. There are. It's not even about, like think about like Kwame's book. He talks about like why do people kind of like sort of they critique him for being so young, and like what dues has he paid, and he talks about like, well, who am I paying these dues to? I'm not talking about dues. I'm talking about what work are you putting in? What are your receipts? You can't check me on you. I want us to get to a place where collectively we're putting in the kind of work that does not. You can't check us. You can't check my receipts, because if you're putting in work that gives you a degree of agency and autonomy in this industry that is undeniable. You can't unknow Vernon once you know it. You can't. And so when you are fortified with those kinds of cultural receipts, it informs everything else you do. And so I want young people, like you said, that question stops a lot of young people in their tracks, because most chefs, most elders aren't asking that question of them. And it's I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a sense that, these young people, we have lots of generational conversations that lament millennials and all this, but that moment, like you said, when you ask a young person, what do you have to say? That's sometimes going to be the first time they've ever been asked that question. And that posture change, that's straight in their spine. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the most valuable experience that you can offer anyone else is a look to your story and into your experience, because that's where all the heat is. When I have culinary interns in any of the kitchens I've worked in, the first question we always talk through is, what do you have to say? Because food is the medium in which you've decided to say it, but what do you have to say first? Because if you can't nail that down, absolutely. Period. Yep. Exactly. Right. Mhm. Exactly. No. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Yes. Because because the question infers that you have something to say. And so when they're like, wait a minute, and it's like, so, that deer in headlights look is usually wrapped up in both. Like, okay, wait a minute, how do I answer this question? And then this woman has just had the audacity to tell me that I had something to say. And now I need to and now I'm charged with finding out what that is. And you look, so well, now look, I've already decided I'm going to try to figure out some type of like final podcast with everybody, because most of these conversations have turned into like, what else can we do? Is there some type of round table on PBS we can start? What can we do? So I am definitely going to be some part twos to a lot of these conversations, because it's just like, for me, that was the point of creating the podcast to begin with, is because I knew that these conversations were being had, and I was having them myself, and it was just like, how can we collectively have it? Like, we need more voices in the conversation. So for now, I was like, thank you so much for your time. We have look, I'm definitely working on a couple of ways to just, gather the ladies one more time. So, it might be like a Google Hangout where people can call in and just ask questions, and we can just kind of create something around that. But there's definitely going to be an opportunity for people to just revisit some of these conversations, because I know anytime I post a new podcast and people listen to it, they're like, oh my gosh, I just didn't know. And so, no one thinks about the person behind that door with the porthole at the restaurant ever, or the person who put that plate of food together. They just don't think past the fact that they had this, they have this white coat on and someone's referred to them as chef, or they've created, they booked your hotel room, or they their name is on it. Like, you just don't think past it. And so I've definitely had some, people just like, thank you so much. Like, I didn't even realize that these things were happening, that a lot of the issues that are currently like in the news and in our political conversations have gone this deep. And I'm like, well, a lot of them started there. As you think about the work that enslaved people did when they first got here, that work was always connected to food production, food management. So a lot of this inequality and a lot of the racism and a lot of the other conversations we are now currently having and are forced to have because of the climate we live in started in these food spaces. They are some of the oldest spaces of inequality and racism in the country. And so just to be able to like have these discussions and have a vigorous and intelligent discussion about them has been definitely next level for me. And I appreciate you. So we will revisit this again, and like I said, I'm going to have to create something because they're just too good to not continue. So thank you again, and like I said, just hit me up with an email with the list of those books and those publications, because it's definitely something that is front of mind for me right now after being in the bookstore, because I got used to using my Kindle or listening on Audible, and I hadn't been in a physical bookstore in a while, and just to see a physical representation of what we've been talking about is challenging. And so for me, I was just like, ooh, it doesn't exist, and they aren't here, the voices aren't here, and that's problematic for me. So definitely I want to get that list of books out to people so they can start buying them and just eating this information. So they are, like you said, they are fortified by it, and they understand they understand their own dopeness, and they understand their own history. And so they know that the tools they need and the tools that the foundation that they need exist, and they just need to tap into it.
Yep. So on the site, like I actually want to like add a couple categories, but I sort of divide up the reading list through, because there's also a lot of like sort of dense academic scholarship that is super. I mean, the rice rabbit hole is one that is just crazy, but they're like yeah. But it's the lists I have on the site now are pretty extensive, and it's kind of running lists. So it's one of those things too. I do like a crowdsource sort of thing every couple of months. Like, okay, what am I missing? I need folks to take a look. Like, what are you reading, and what should I be adding to the list? But it's kind of, everything's broken up into like, so this is Southern Studies, this is Black Cultural Studies, this is the chefs you should be thinking about, this is the
perfect. Okay, so we'll forget the list, and I'll just go ahead and share the site and make sure people know, like, go check that if you need to know what to read over the coming season. I always have a summer reading list, and then I'll have a fall reading list. And I'm like, in the upcoming months, when you're traveling and you have some time, definitely to dig into some reading, which is something you should do anyway. But I digress.
Jubilee is one book. It's on my mind just because I just did an interview with her. I'm writing a piece for Taste. But Tony Tintin Martin's follow-up to Jemima Code is called Jubilee, and it's like the cookbook companion to the book to Jemima Code, and it's pretty dope. Like, this is the fall book you're gonna want to think about. Okay. Because she uses the 300 cookbooks to kind of, like, if you read Soul by Ty Richards, he uses encyclopedia almost, like he goes by ingredients to sort of define soul food or Black foodways. And then you look at like From Harlem Heaven by J.J. Johnson and Alexander Smalls, and they sort of use the Cecil and sort of diaspora conversation to sort of give us a blueprint for what diasporic cooking looks like. But I think that what Jubilee does is use heritage and uses these historical cookbooks to sort of cook in a modern way, and she got Gerald Guy to do the food styling. So it's pretty darn
nice.
spectacular.
Okay. Now, for listeners and people tuning in who want to follow you or find out what you're doing, or if they want to, just get connected, where do they need to look?
So the site is blackculinaryhistory.com. And then on socials in general, I'm Black Culinary most places. And then also our network, when I started this work 10 years ago, it was literally the bombast of a 20-something. But I started with this sort of, I called it a manifesto at the time, but I sent it to like 40 people. It was chefs of folks by degrees of separation that I knew and wanted to sort of start network with. But we've grown to a global network of over 3,500 chefs, just cooking, writing, farming, really around the world. Our network there's a really dope collective in London, there's folks in Australia. It's really an awesome community. So it's based on Facebook now because it's sort of social networking part. But folks share, articles and good news and what they're doing, the work they're doing. And it's just it's a community that grew organically. And it's just, I refuse to have a conversation with anybody about lack of community because I literally built it and I see it growing every day. So just Black Culinary History is the site and our group on Facebook, and I'm Black Culinary everywhere.
I might want to hit the mute button. All right. Now, do you podcast? Do you have like a running podcast at this point? Is there?
I don't, and I think that's the thing, right? Like my day-to-day life is so like fully entrenched in the kitchen. But I do a lot of freelance writing. So like I write now for Taste mainly. But like I do public talks probably once or twice a month. There's, sort of panels and these kinds of conversations are really being had in cultural spaces in a more expansive way, which is I'm excited about. Like we just did Schomburg Center's Literary Festival. Food and Grooves is going to happen in October. Firefly on Fork is a dope conference or food festival in Richmond. So I'll be doing a historical dinner. Then I feel like the work I do is mainly like out in cultural spaces because I think that I think non-culinary cultural spaces are going to be sort of new battleground for Black food conversations. I'm looking at like Brian Terry and the work he's doing at Moab in San Francisco. It's like that's the first time a museum has a chef in residence, but the work he's doing there proves the power of thinking broadly about food culture as parts of sort of broader culture. So the work I'm doing recently, especially, is sort of pairing writing with sort of cultural culinary commentary. So it's been interesting to sort of see that space open up in that way. But I think that it's taking other sort of cultural disciplines to sort of infuse and include the food conversation. Because to your point earlier about the lens of food being a clarifying force in a lot of these political, socioeconomic, community-based conversations, the lens of food sort of cuts through a lot of the sort of circular talking and makes clear a lot of these issues. So then that's kind of where my work is centering these days.
All right. Well, thank you again. If you guys please follow, engage, become a part of the community. Like you said, like she said, there's no excuse for not using the communities available to you because they're out there and you are not out here doing this work by yourself. So don't isolate yourself. And, so it's available if you want it. So again, it's just time to do it. So I was like, we have run low on excuses at this point. So just get connected and watch it grow. Thank you for listening to this week's Afros and Knives podcast episode. Don't forget to reach out and leave us a comment or give us some feedback on this week's episode. Let us know what you enjoyed, if you have any questions, or if you just want to jump in on this week's conversation. You can visit www.afrosandknives.com in order to just add your voice to the conversation. And we'd absolutely love that. Don't forget to catch us on iTunes, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you may podcast. New episodes are available every Tuesday, usually right around 8 or 9 p.m. Mountain Time. So it's going to be a little later for you folks on the East Coast. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Those places are the best places to find out when new episodes are coming up and who is going to be featured in them. We have a couple of more episodes in this season, and I just want to thank everyone who has listened in on one episode, a half an episode, 2 seconds of an episode, or every single episode. Your support is much appreciated, and it just doesn't get done, unless there's an audience. So thank you so much. It's definitely a community, and I love having everyone as part of this new community of people. There are a lot of things in the works for the next season. We're hoping to add some video components, and so we're looking to just get that extension funded at this point. So you might see a Kickstarter pop up or a couple of other opportunities to just become a bigger support of the podcast at this point. We are already on Patreon, if you did not know that already, and it's just patreon.com/Afros and Knives, and you can jump on there and just check out all of the thank you gifts and things available for our patrons. So thank you again for just listening in this season. I cannot believe we've already gotten through 10 episodes so far. So the last 2 are again drop every Tuesday, and then we'll put together kind of a season finale type episode and just regather all of our interviews and see if we can get one big interview going with a live audience. So definitely check the website and keep your eyes on social media just to see when that will happen and how you can be a part of it. At the end of the season, there will be an official podcast calendar available. Don't forget to buy your official season 1 t-shirt because it will not be available after the end of September. And there'll be a new t-shirt available for season 2. So if some of your favorites were interviewed during season 1 and you want to rock that shirt with their names on it, definitely get that shirt now before the end of the month. So again, thank you for listening in on this week's episode. I hope you got a lot from it. Be sure to visit the Black Culinary History website and just get that list of books and reading material that that everyone should have in their library, or at least stored somewhere mentally, and again, be a part of the conversation. So we will catch you next week.